You know the God we worship today as the supreme creator, the Lord of the worlds, the Alpha and the Omega, the one who was, who is, and who will be. Well, what if this God was not always considered the only God? What if he wasn't always supreme? What if once he was just one God among many? This may sound like an insane theory, but hear me out. A few weeks ago, I did a video covering the evidence for Jesus having lived. And one key point I made was that the God worshipped by early Christians wasn't exactly the God we know today. Yah, the God of Israel, was known in his own right long before he became the one true God. His story is one that doesn't only deal with theology or the history of religion, it's also political and cultural history. This is part one of a two-part series looking at the origins of the God we know today. So let's go back to the beginning and see how Yah first came to be. They will cover the rise of monotheism and the emergence of Yah as the God of Abraham. But today, I want to answer one simple question. Who was Yah when he wasn't the one and only God? Earliest appearances of Yah. The earliest appearance of Yah comes from a curse tablet discovered in the West Bank at Mount Ebal, dating back to the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. The text reads, "Cursed be anyone who does not stand by the gods of Israel and the house of El, and who does not fear our Rephaim." The name here is YHW, which scholars believe is an early form of Yahweh, with the tetragrammaton being the most common pronunciation. The text associates him with the house of El, pointing us towards a possible Canaanite origin for the deity, a people group that inhabited the region during that time period. Another early inscription mentioning Yahweh comes from the Mesha Stele, also called the Moabite stone, named so because it was discovered in 1868 near the Moabite city of Dibon. This artifact is a historical record left behind by Mesha, king of Moab, recounting his military victories against Israel. One such victory involved the plundering of a temple belonging to Yahweh in the city of Ataroth. It took place around 853 BC, making it almost 400 years after the curse tablet from Mount Ebal. In the third year of the reign of Omri, king of Israel, the Bible tells us that Mesa rebelled against his suzerain, paying tribute to the king of Assyria instead. The archaeological evidence confirms this. On the Mesha Stele, Mesa boasts of Yahweh's defeat and the plunder of his temple. In verse 47 it reads, "And I returned and fought against Israel, and removed their border from Aroth, the city of the palm wood, and slew many of them, and took Oboth and its fields. And I brought back the border of my land to its ancient border, and I brought back all who dwelt there in it." But not only do we find mention of Yahweh in Moabite records, we find him mentioned in Egypt as well. For example, an inscription from the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled from 1213 to 1203 BC, includes Yahweh among the enemies that he defeated. This isn't too surprising, given the proximity between Egypt and Canaan during the late Bronze Age. But the fact that Yahweh appears alongside other Canaanite gods as an enemy of Egypt paints a picture of Yah as a local deity, perhaps one of a tribal nature, similar to the many gods Egypt would have encountered along their eastern border. These early references to Yahweh show us a deity unlike the one we know today. He's not yet the supreme creator of the universe. Rather, he appears to be a storm god, a warrior deity, and a protector of desert wanderers, a kind of patron god of the tribes who roamed the deserts of Canaan. At this time, he wasn't even known as Yahweh, but by another name, one that can't be uttered by those who speak Hebrew. For the name Yahweh comes later, evolving from the tribal chant used by a wandering people as they move from being a tribe to becoming a nation. We don't know much about this period of Yah's history. He was clearly not the only God, but he must have been considered quite important, since his name was whispered among the rebels who dared to challenge the mighty empires of the ancient world. He was a God of power, the God of Abraham's forefathers, the God of the oppressed, a warrior who fought alongside his people and whose presence moved with them. The Israelites knew him as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but most others didn't know him at all. As we continue our look into the pre-monotheistic Yahweh, we start to see connections between him and other Semitic deities, such as Baal, the supreme god of the Canaanites, whom the Israelites also knew. Some scholars argue that these connections aren't coincidences, but signs of a shared tradition. As the Israelites interacted with their neighbors, they would have been exposed to different cultures, customs, and beliefs, which no doubt influenced their understanding of their own God. In fact, one of the most prominent parallels between Yahweh and other deities comes from his name. The root of the name Yahweh comes from the Hebrew word Ehyeh, which means to be. When you look at other Semitic languages, such as Akkadian, you find a similar meaning. The supreme god was called Iyah, which means he who is, or Enki, which means he who brings into being. These parallels suggest that the name Yahweh was likely a development of an older tradition. In a way, this makes sense. After all, the name Yahweh points to an essential aspect of the God of Abraham. He's the one who was, who is, and who will be. He's eternal. During the period when the Israelites were still a tribe, and later as they became a nation under kings like David and Solomon, Yahweh's role continued to evolve. He remained a warrior god, a stormbringer, and the protector of his people, but he grew in power. As the nation of Israel grew in numbers, wealth, and influence, so did their God. As the head of the Davidic dynasty, Solomon united Israel like never before, creating a vast empire that stretched from Egypt to Lebanon. Under Solomon's rule, Yahweh's temple stood in Jerusalem, a house of prayer for all who worshipped him. The nation prospered, trade flourished, and peace reigned throughout the land. Yet despite this apparent unity, divisions were forming within the kingdom. As the nation grew, so did the disparity between rich and poor. The people began to stray from God, worshipping other gods and forsaking the God of their forefathers. The prophets spoke out against this apostasy, calling the people to repentance and warning them of God's judgment. Among them, Isaiah stands out, a prophet who foretold of a coming judgment that would divide the kingdom and bring ruin upon Jerusalem. Yet amidst this darkness, Isaiah also prophesied of a bright light that would come for the people, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a descendant of King David who would be king over Israel. This Messiah would bring salvation, peace, and righteousness. However, the people wouldn't listen. They rejected Isaiah's message and chose to follow their own desires. So God allowed the kingdom to be divided. The northern tribes broke away, establishing their own kingdoms in defiance of the southern kingdom of Judah. And so began a long and bloody history of civil wars, foreign invasions, and divine judgment. For several centuries, Israel and Judah would go through periods of blessing and hardship. There were times when God raised up faithful kings like Hezekiah, who led the people back to Yahweh, and there were times when wicked rulers like Manasseh led them astray. The history of these periods is filled with stories of courage, faith, and despair, of faithfulness and rebellion, of obedience and disobedience. Through it all, Yahweh remained constant, a faithful God who kept his promises and a just God who judged sin. Yet despite all this, both kingdoms fell, Israel in 722 BC and Judah in 586 BC. The people were scattered across the world, their cities lay in ruins, and their temple was destroyed. It seemed as though God had abandoned his people forever. This is where the story takes a turn. For as the people scattered, the God of Abraham changed. Part 2 will cover the rise of monotheism, the rise of Yah as the one true God. Yahweh originally was the God of only one tribe of Israel, but later became the God of the whole nation. So let's talk about how that happened. This is the second episode in our series called How We Got From Here to Here. As we saw last time, Yahweh began as the deity of a small Canaanite tribe. But as the tribes of Israel united under his banner and won their independence from the Canaanites, Yahweh's worship grew alongside the kingdom. David, who had previously been a local king, became the king of all Israel, and he made Jerusalem the capital. And it was here that David established Yahweh's worship at the Jebusun mountain, the city's highest point near his palace. And his son Solomon built the first temple right there on that spot. The temple would serve as both the spiritual and political headquarters of Yahweh for centuries to come. So the more Israel expanded, the more Yahweh's influence spread, and this was a process that happened over generations. To simplify things, we're going to reduce the timeline down to just 4 reigns, which are highlighted here in green on this chart. So let's go through each one. We mentioned last time that the early Israelites were henotheistic, meaning they acknowledged other gods, but considered Yahweh to be the one true God. This is often misunderstood as a kind of Henotheism, where Yahweh eventually becomes fully a mono, like an invisible bridge between the two. You could also call it proto-monotheism if you want, but I prefer henotheism because the Hebrew Bible itself never explicitly states that Yahweh is the one and only God, even in the books that were written after he became the national God of Israel. The best example of this henotheism is found in the story of Elijah challenging the prophets of Baal. In 1 Kings 18, Elijah has just informed King Ahab that Yahweh is the one true God. And Ahab calls all the prophets of Baal to gather on Mount Carmel, and they all cry out to their God to bring fire down from heaven. And the people are pretty amped about this. They're watching intently to see who will prevail. And after the prophets of Baal have failed, Elijah begins to mock them. And it's at this moment that Elijah says, "Hey, look, Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, he alone is real." And then he proceeds to build an altar and sacrifice a bull and calls out to Yahweh to consume the offering. And Yahweh does send fire from heaven and consumes the burnt offering, his altar, the stones and the water in the trench. And it's a pretty intense scene. But the thing to note here is that Elijah doesn't tell the people to stop worshipping other gods. He just tells them that Yahweh is the one true God. And if you read between the lines, it seems like most of the people agree, at least tacitly. And there are many similar instances throughout the Hebrew Bible where the Yahweh of Israel is pitted against the gods of other nations, and Yahweh comes out on top. Another good example is the Merneptah stele. This is an Egyptian pharaoh stele that lists all of the gods he defeated in battle, and it dates back to around 1207 BC. And on it, Merneptah boasts about defeating Israel and Yahweh. And here's how it goes. Israel is laid waste, and Yahweh is taken captive. Now some take this as evidence that the Israelites were monotheistic at the time, since if they worshipped Yahweh and Yahweh alone, then it wouldn't make sense for them to kidnap Yahweh. But I don't think that's a very strong argument. I mean, Henotheism is technically polytheism, and allowing your God to be captured by your enemies isn't exactly a good look for said God. And besides, ancient people regularly kidnap deities. It's actually a pretty common motif in ancient Near Eastern literature. And even later in the Bible, the Israelites are said to have done the same thing. In Judges 12 it says, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and the children of Israel came and carried away Manasseh son of Joseph from Mount Ephraim and set him up as king over themselves." So I wouldn't say that this Merneptah stele provides any real insight into their beliefs. What does shed light on their beliefs are these 2 inscriptions found on altars. The first comes from the Tel Dan site and reads, "Moldau, the god of El, Adonai, the god of Abraham, El, Yahweh, the God of David." and it's probably from the 9th century BC, and the second is known as the House of David inscription, and it reads, House of David at Jerusalem. Yahweh hath established for David his servant in Jerusalem. These inscriptions show us that Yahweh was still being grouped with other gods, and yet there's a clear understanding that Yahweh is superior to the rest. And so I would argue that Yahwehism was simply a form of Henotheism, or acknowledging other gods but elevating Yahweh above them. And that's how it stayed for quite a while. Even when Yahweh became the national god of Israel, he was still paired with the goddess Asherah. In fact, it wasn't until much later that the Hebrew Bible began to erase all mention of the sacred feminine. This happened twice, first under the reign of Hezekiah and then again under Josiah. And both times it was during a reform. In 2 Kings 23, we read about the reforms of Josiah, who was only 25 years old when he became king. And here's how it goes. Thus Hezekiah did in Judah what Josiah did in Israel. Hezekiah, son of King Ahaz, removed the high places, broke the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah. Hezekiah forced King Manasseh to abandon the gods of Judah. He shut the doors of the high places and broke the sacred stones in pieces and threw their dust on the graves of Tophet. He demolished the altars and made it a desolate field, a pasture for flocks. And this passage makes it seem as though Asherah was some kind of demon, some kind of idol that needed to be smashed and purged from the land. But the way the word Asherah is used in the Hebrew Bible is pretty ambiguous. Sometimes it refers to a grove of trees that was sacred, sometimes it refers to an object or an image, and sometimes it refers to a goddess. Most scholars lean towards it being a goddess because the Bible repeatedly pairs Yahweh with her. So let's take a look at some of those pairings. First, we have Deuteronomy 6, 4-5. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Some people interpret this verse as evidence of early monotheism, because the word one is often translated as one and only, or unique. But if we look at the etymology of the Hebrew word one here, we find that it means sole, single, or only. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So in the original language, this verse was saying Yahweh our God, Yahweh is single, or perhaps better, Yahweh is our God, and there is no other God besides him. And if we really want to understand what this verse is getting at, we need to consider the cultural context. Back then, having multiple gods was normal. And if your local king died, you wouldn't really be surprised to hear that his successor was the son of the king before him, and that he was chosen by his father's God to continue his father's legacy. That's why kings like to have their statues erected beside the statues of previous kings, showing the lineage of rulers and gods. So to say that Yahweh is one in the context of the ancient world was pretty revolutionary. It was essentially saying that Yahweh is our God, and no other God has the authority to replace him. And that claim wasn't limited to Deuteronomy 6. The idea of Yahweh being one is repeated numerous times throughout the Torah. For example, in Exodus 22, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. And once again, the emphasis here is on exclusive worship. If you followed Yahweh, then he expected you to be loyal to him alone. But back to Asherah, notice that Yahweh is always described as Yahweh, whereas Asherah is just Asherah, and this reflects their respective roles. Yahweh was seen as king, supreme commander, and lawgiver, and Asherah was his consort. She was queen, and she assisted him in the creation of Israel. In the ancient Near East, the king and the queen were considered a divine pair. They were two halves of the same divine coin, and this is reflected in the blessing given to Abraham in Genesis 17:6. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. So Yahweh and Asherah gave Abraham descendants who would become a nation, and then kings would come from that nation. However, as the monarchy grew, it became more centralized, and the role of the queen became less important. After all, you don't need a queen when you have a king. And so Yahweh's consort was erased from the temple and replaced by Yahweh alone. This erasure was likely a political move, a way to ensure the unity of the people under one God and under one king. To further solidify Yahweh's power, he began absorbing the functions of other gods. As we saw last time, Yahweh took on the traits of the storm god, Enlil. And we can see this in the Psalms, which frequently compare Yahweh to the raging storm. Yahweh also took on the traits of the wisdom god, Enki, and of the warrior god, Ninurta. And in doing so, he absorbed the function of an entire pantheon. And that's how we went from Yahweh being the God of a single tribe to Yahweh being the God of an entire nation. Yahweh's baggage is starting to show. His people have been carried away from their land. Their sacred space, the temple, has been looted and destroyed. And now they are stuck in a foreign country with no home to go back to. The God who delivered Israel from Egypt couldn't even protect them from the Babylonians. So it's easy to see why some would despair. But in the midst of this defeat, something interesting happens. Instead of dying, Yahweh's image is reborn. But he doesn't come back as the tribal storm god who defends the northern kingdom of Israel. He comes back as the one and only God. As we saw last time, this shift from many gods to one God was a slow process that happened over several centuries, with Yahweh gradually absorbing the roles of the other gods. But during the Babylonian exile, this transformation was complete. Yahweh was now the one true God, the only God. And this new understanding of Yahweh is reflected in the books of Isaiah 40-66 and Genesis 1, which were written during this time period by priests. These are what scholars call priestly texts. In these texts, we see a few notable changes in Yahweh's character. First, he's now called the creator of all things. In Genesis 1, Yahweh creates the world and everything in it. This includes the heavenly bodies like the sun, moon, and stars. It also includes the land of Israel, which was previously thought to be the product of a primordial sea monster. But Yahweh made it clear that he alone is responsible for creating everything. Second, Yahweh is now more distant and transcendent. He sits on a throne and rules over the cosmos. He is too great and awesome to be fully comprehended by humans. Finally, Yahweh is now a God of universal ethics. He expects all people everywhere to follow his laws. Universalism is actually a theme throughout Isaiah 40:66. For example, in Isaiah 42:6 it says, "My servant, whom I have chosen, whom I have put as a light to the nations, that he should be the light of my salvation at my command." So here, Yahweh is saying that he chose one person to represent him among the nations, but the meaning of nations in Hebrew is plural. It can refer to more than one group. So could it be that Yahweh put more than one person as a light to the nations? So looking at these characteristics, it seems clear that Yahweh has changed. He's now a composite identity. That is, he is a title, a divine office or persona that encompasses various aspects of earlier gods. In other words, when the priests said Yahweh is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they meant that he is the one true God who created the world, who judges the nations, and who delivers his people. This character absorbed the roles of the earlier gods, Enlil, Enki, and Marduk. Enlil was the Akkadian storm god and head of the pantheon, whose consort was the goddess Ninlil. Scholars think that Enlil may have been originally a Canaanite deity named El, who was the father of the gods and king of the underworld. The Ugarit texts call him the rider on the clouds, just like Yahweh in the Bible. In fact, scholars think that Yahweh may have originated from a weather cult that worshipped the storm god El, who they believed controlled rain, thunder, and lightning. This weather cult may have been part of the larger Canaanite religion, which influenced the Israelites during the time of the monarchy. Another layer to this composite character is the figure of Enki. Enki was the Akkadian god of wisdom and magic. He was the son of the first gods, Apsu and Tiamat, and brother of the storm god Enlil. Enki was very popular in Mesopotamia, where temples dedicated to him were built in every major city. He was known as the Lord of the Abyss, the Deep One, and the Lord of Creation. Some scholars believe that Enki is related to the Hebrew figure of Enoch, who appears in Genesis 5:21 and 6:4, where he is described as a righteous man who walked with God. Another possible connection between Enki and Yahweh is found in the book of Job, where Yahweh boasts that he is the Lord of the world. This is a direct quote from Enki's own boastful hymn. In addition, Yahweh is sometimes called the God of the spirits in Job, which may refer to the demonic forces that Enki commanded. These connections suggest that Yahweh has taken on some of Enki's divine attributes, such as wisdom and control over the spiritual realm. The final layer to Yahweh's composite character is the figure of Marduk. Marduk was the patron god of Babylon. He was the son of the sky god and the moon god Sin. Marduk defeated the dragon Tiamat and became the supreme ruler of the universe. He was credited with saving mankind from destruction and establishing the order of nature. Scholars think that Marduk may have been originally a West Semitic storm god who was adopted into the Akkadian pantheon. He became very popular in Babylon, where he was identified with the sun god Shamash and given the epithet King of the Universe. Some scholars believe that Marduk's identification with Shamash gave him the ability to bring light into darkness and heal the sick. This may be related to Yahweh's own healing ministry as recorded in the Gospels. In addition, Marduk was often depicted as a warrior god who fought against evil powers and demons. He was associated with the planet Jupiter, which was called the Star of Marduk. This may be connected to Yahweh's own victory over the forces of chaos and his rule over the demonic realm. These connections indicate that Yahweh has incorporated some of Marduk's heroic and cosmic aspects into his own character, such as his ability to bring light into darkness and his authority over the demonic realm. The picture that emerges from these texts and connections is that of a complex and multifaceted deity who combines elements of different Mesopotamian gods and figures. But was Yahweh really just a copy of other gods? Was he simply a product of cultural diffusion and syncretism? Or was there something more to Yahweh's character? Maybe the real question isn't who Yahweh was, but why humanity needed him. We seem to have started with a tribal storm god, then moved to a national deity, then to a cosmic father, and finally to an internal principle. I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating that the divine may not dwell in a name. It may dwell in consciousness. If the divine is within us, if the divine is within you right now, then there is no need to look for it in a book or a myth or a story or a tradition. You already have it. The problem is that we often get in our own way when it comes to recognizing the divine within ourselves and others. We do this in various ways, such as through fear, anger, greed, lust, and pride. These are the things that block our access to the divine, both within ourselves and within others. When we overcome these obstacles, we open ourselves up to the possibility of experiencing the divine. There is a story in the Talmud, a collection of Jewish writings, that illustrates this point. Once the sages were sitting in the house of Rabbi Akiva, and they began to discuss the matter of the Shekinah, which is the divine presence that rested upon the high priest when he entered the Holy of Holies. They argued about how the Shekinah could be understood. Then Rabbi Akiva stood up, lifted up his garment and said, "Is it really so hard for you to understand how the Shekinah can be within me?" The sages were puzzled. So Rabbi Akiva explained that the Shekinah is like a drop of wine in a sea of vinegar. Just as the drop of wine represents the highest quality of taste and aroma, the Shekinah represents the highest level of spirituality and wisdom. Similarly, just as the drop of wine cannot be separated from the vinegar, the Shekinah cannot be separated from the body. In other words, the Shekinah is not somewhere else. It is here in this very place. What prevents us from saying that the Shekinah is within each of us, here in this very place? We are living in a time when many people are searching for meaning and purpose in a world that seems increasingly chaotic and uncertain. People are turning away from traditional sources of authority and looking for new ways to understand themselves and the world around them. This presents both challenges and opportunities for spreading awareness. The challenge is that people are bombarded with a constant stream of information, and it can be difficult to get their attention. Opportunity is that people are more open than ever to exploring different ideas and perspectives. The important thing is that you stay true to yourself and don't compromise your values or beliefs in order to appeal to a wider audience. Authenticity and integrity are essential for building trust and credibility. You also need to be patient and persistent. Spreading awareness takes time and effort, and you may not see results immediately. But if you stay committed to your goals, you can make a difference. And that is why I want to invite you to subscribe. By subscribing, you'll be joining a community of people who are also interested in these topics and who want to learn more about them. You'll also be helping to support the channel and enable us to reach a wider audience. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.